Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Translationborne, the show where we take a look at the English translation of Bloodborne. We're going to dive right in with an item analysis here, but after that we're not going to find very much in this episode, so we're going to spend a lot of time going back and looking over some points that I had to skip in prior episodes, and that includes some stat-related terms. But first, I'd like to start by analyzing that item that I just picked up. Frenzied coldblood. A rich droplet of coldblood containing blood echoes, used to gain frenzied blood echoes. This manifestation of madness comes from a mind teetering on the very brink, but has a sane mind ever produced anything of true significance? So, as usual for items with reference to blood echoes, this one has a lot of things to talk about. To give you an idea, I am once again going to put the official translation up on the screen while I read you a more literal version. Don't mind my poisoning this guy in the background. Rich, fragrant death blood where the dying will of blood resides, used to gain insane dying wishes of blood. This is true insanity, not something that belonged to an ordinary person. Although, how worthless is it to be ordinary? As you can see, there's quite a lot going on here, but let's start right from the top. First, you may have noticed that the official translation is a rich droplet of cold blood, and my more literal version was rich, fragrant death blood. The Japanese word in question here is this one, hojun. And there are two things that I think are particularly interesting about the use of this word. First, in addition to describing something that is rich or strong in flavor, it also does have that nuance of fragrance to it. Bloodborne is a game that very prominently features the senses and sensory information, and smell is particularly emphasized. Think back to the pungent blood cocktail, for instance. And that actually brings me back to the second point that I think is worth bringing up in relation to the word hojun, or rich and fragrant. In Japanese, it's a word that is frequently used to describe the taste or fragrance of sake. So, as we've seen in the pungent blood cocktail as well, we have a consistent linking between the effects of alcohol and the effects of blood in Bloodborne. Alright, now let's get back to some of the differences between the English and Japanese versions of the frenzied cold blood. And actually, it's that term frenzied that I'd like to talk about. The Japanese that's being used here is hyokiteki, and a more common literal translation of this term is insane. With that having been said though, this word is hardly very clinical. In fact, it's probably a bit closer to the term madness in English. It does describe someone who's lost their senses or whose mental state is abnormal, but it's not really a term you'd use to describe someone with, say, clinical depression. And critically, it's a term that tends to be associated with heightened emotional intensity. When you experience kyoki or madness, you might express that by laughing maniacally or lashing out blindly, but it's typically thought of as something that forces you to lose control or that blows your mind. It's not generally something that's thought of as calming you down or numbing your feelings. As a result, I feel like the term frenzied is perfectly appropriate here, particularly in the sense of a violent mental or emotional agitation. Now, part of the reason I wanted to go into such detail to look at the definition of this word frenzied is that it's actually an important game-related term similar to blood echoes. And I'm going to continue analyzing it in that sense a little bit later, but I would also like to point out that in the specific case of this item, the frenzied cold blood, there's additional contextual information that helps you zero in on the correct sense of the term frenzied. Namely, there's the phrase, "This manifestation of madness comes from a mind teetering on the very brink." And this brings me to the last thing I'd like to comment on about the frenzied cold blood. That final set of lines, "This manifestation of madness comes from a mind teetering on the very brink, but has a sane mind never produced anything of true significance," is noticeably different than the more literal, "This is true insanity, not something that belonged to an ordinary person." Although, how worthless is it to be ordinary? When thought about in the context of the game though, I think it works. The first part of the phrase clarifies the use of the term frenzied, and the second part gets at the spirit of the question, how worthless is it to be an ordinary person, while the use of the term produced emphasizes the blood echoes that you get from using this item. Now then, let's see what our friend dropped for us here. Bolt paper. Coarse paper that applies bolt to weapons when rubbed. Invented by Archibald, the infamous eccentric of the Healing Church workshop. Artificially recreates the blue sparks that are said to surround dark beasts. Unlike the other strange weapons created by Archibald, this one was favored by many hunters, in particular those who had even once laid eyes on a dark beast. So for the most part, this is a fairly straightforward translation, but there are a few things I think it would be interesting to point out. First of all, note the name of the item in Japanese. The term in question here is yasuri, and technically it's used to refer to a kind of file or rasp that's used to cut into and shape things. In actual use, however, the term is frequently used to refer to sandpaper. And that's really the idea that's being evoked here in Bloodborne. You can see that in the first line of the description. Coarse paper that applies bolt to weapons when rubbed. And this actually brings me to my next point. The original Japanese term for what's being translated as applies is what you see on the screen here, matou. And more literally, this term carries the connotation of being clad in something. You can see why they would translate this as applies rather than make weapon be clad in. But the interesting thing to me is that in Japanese, this same term is used to describe the field of bolts that is given off by dark beasts. Here the official translation in question is, artificially recreates the blue sparks that are said to surround dark beasts. Again, the literal implications here are a little bit different. Think of that line as reading, artificially recreates the blue sparks that dark beasts are said to clad themselves in. Now, I think in context, both of the translation choices that were officially made make perfect sense. But knowing that the term for applying bolt to a weapon and the description of the aura that surrounds dark beasts are actually the same Japanese word, I think does add a little bit more nuance. It emphasizes to me that the result is the same. Archibald really has recreated the same effect. Speaking of dark beasts, though, I wanted to briefly bring up the translation of that term as well. These are the characters used for dark beast, and please disregard my violent death. Literally, they mean black beast, and I thought that was worth noting, even though I do think that dark beast is a much better term. While I run back, though, let's take another look at the Kirkhammer. Kirkhammer, a trick weapon typically used by healing church hunters. On the one side, an easily handled silver sword. On the other, a giant obtuse stone weapon, characterized by a blunt strike and extreme force of impact. The church takes a heavy-handed, merciless stance toward the plague of beasts, an irony not lost upon the wielders of this most symbolic weapon. So we talked briefly about the Kirkhammer before, and I noted that I really liked the translation of its name. But that actual description that I just read you is something that I really wanted to get back to. Let's compare it with a more literal translation. A trick weapon used by healing church hunters in particular. It possesses two extreme aspects, an easily wielded silver sword and a giant blunt stone hammer. The latter heavy strike and severe force of impact in particular characterize this weapon. The Healing Church Workshop represents one of two main factions when it comes to hunters' trick weapons, and it's said that it was once tucked away somewhere in the cathedral ward. And having seen that comparison, I think you can probably tell why I was so anxious to get back to talking about this weapon. The final block of text in the English and the final block of text in the Japanese appear to be entirely different. I have no idea what the explanation for this might be, except that perhaps the English text was translated from something that was later changed in the Japanese text. Things can change around a lot in video game development. That having been said, the effect of this difference is quite pronounced. The Japanese version not only gives you something of a clue as to a hidden location in the game, it also gives you an interesting extra bit of lore, namely that there were two main factions when it came to creating trick weapons for hunters. The English version, on the other hand, emphasizes the symbolic importance of the weapon. Finally, I feel that I should note that I have repeatedly checked to make sure that this difference is still in the game. As of version 1.09, which is the latest version as this is being recorded, this discrepancy still exists. So while I'm generally a fan of the first 2/3 of the translation for the description of the Kirkhammer, I don't understand what happened with that last part, and I thought it was important to note. With that out of the way, though, I wanted to get back to some of the discussion of game-related terms that I was talking about at the beginning of the episode. So, at the end of the previous episode, we picked up our first Carol rune. And you may remember that I noted that I liked the translation of that particular term. Literally, the Japanese for that is karerumoji, and it would translate to something like Carol letters. Except here's what that word air looks like in Carol letters. Clearly, it doesn't look like any kind of lettering system at all. These are symbols meant to inscribe the meaning of certain sounds. Now take a look at this table of Anglo-Saxon runes. Note that each one has a specific pronunciation, a letter that it represents, and also an inherent meaning. And in addition to that, runes were also thought to possess special, secret powers. They were supposed to be able to affect the world, to allow you to make curses or cast spells. And though we haven't seen it yet, this is very fitting for the function that they serve in Bloodborne. Really, I think this is an ideal translation choice for Carol letters. But that's not the only game-related term that we can find in the description of the air rune that I think works very well. There's also the term Visceral Attack. Here, the Japanese in question is Naizo Kogeki, and literally it would translate to something like internal organ attack. And clearly that term leaves a little something to be desired. So where does visceral come into all of this? Well, visceral is an adjective formed from the plural noun viscera, and viscera are the internal organs of the body, especially the ones located in the great cavity of the trunk proper. That definition also comes from Merriam-Webster, by the way. Anyway, by calling those moves visceral attacks, you specify that they relate to the internal organs, which stays true to the Japanese. At the same time, you also gain the extra nuances that the word visceral brings in and of itself. That is, you highlight how satisfying that move can be to perform, the player feels it viscerally, and you also get at the idea that these attacks are crude, emotional, instinctive, and unreasoning. Really, I think this is another fairly ideal translation choice. Moving on though, now that I'm fighting these guys with the weird cross-like weapons, I wanted to go back and talk a little more about the translation of frenzy. This bar that you can see slowly filling up on the screen is my frenzy meter, and if it ever becomes full, I would instantly lose 70% of my HP. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit technical with some of the status effects in this game. Bear with me though, because ultimately I do think this matters for the translation of certain terms that we've encountered before. Alright, so both the size of that frenzy gauge and the speed at which it fills up are determined by your frenzy resistance. And what controls your frenzy resistance? Well, it could be your specific set of attire or whatever runes you may or may not have equipped. But critically, it's also determined by your insight. Remember this number up here? The higher it is, the lower your frenzy resistance will be. Recall that insight represents your character's understanding of the truth behind the world. It can be gained, for instance, from the madman's knowledge item. In the Japanese, insight is pretty strongly linked to rationality and the Enlightenment, and frenzy has that nuance of madness and insanity. So here we're seeing a direct connection between one's understanding of the world intellectually and one's susceptibility to madness. And critically, I feel that this connection works in English as well. The more insight you have into the way the world works, the more likely you are to lose it and go into a state of frenzy. But enough on that for now. Let's go knock on this door.
Bless us with blood. Bless us with blood.
Okay, you kind of seem like you're off in your own world. Let me go talk to your neighbor here and see what they have to say.
Bless us with blood. Bless us with blood.
Well, the people in this area seem pretty obsessed. To actually comment on the translation, though, I feel like this one is pretty straightforward. The Japanese being spoken here is actually an incomplete sentence, but if you were to do something of a literal translation, you might come out with, "Grant us the blessing of blood." And I feel like that translation of "bless us with blood" is a great way to get a similar idea across in a more succinct form. I also particularly like the idea that in this form, the phrase has much more of the feel of a chant to it in English. There's something about that short form and the alliteration that just makes it seem a little bit more natural for people to be chanting than "grant us the blessing of blood" over and over again. Another thing I particularly like about this translation is that it does a good job of preserving the ambiguity of the original. Because the phrase "bless us with blood" could mean one of two things. It could be a fairly straightforward request of "please give us blood," or they could be asking to be blessed through the use of blood. You can see this in the more literal version I gave as well. When they ask for the blessing of blood, are they asking for blood itself, or the blessing that the blood will bring? I tend to think that it's more likely they're asking for blood itself. But either way, it brings up the question of the sanctity of blood. It's either considered to be a blessing in and of itself, a vehicle for other blessings, or both. And really, this makes sense for a town that's run by the healing church. Especially since, as Gilbert tells us, the church controls all knowledge on blood ministration and all varieties of blood. So it seems pretty clear that at least some people venerate the blood of the healing church. And indeed, blood and its relationship to the divine is something that we'll continue to explore as we make our way through the game. For now though, there's one more weapon that we picked up earlier in the game that I wanted to go back and take a closer look at. In fact, depending on what choice you made, this could have been the very first weapon you got. Hunter Axe, one of the trick weapons of the workshop commonly used on the hunt. Retains the qualities of an axe, but offers a wider palette of attacks by transforming. Boasts a heavy blunt attack, leading to high rally potential. No matter their pasts, beasts are no more than beasts. Some choose this axe to play the part of executioner. So this is another item that we've briefly discussed before. Fortunately, unlike with the Kirkhammer, the English and the Japanese versions do line up like you'd expect here. But there were a couple aspects of this translation, especially as they relate to the game as a whole, that I wanted to get back to take a closer look at. First, there's one line that gives us some pretty critical information about how the axe works as a weapon in this game. So let's compare and contrast a more literal translation with the official version of the line in question. Again, this is regarding the axe. Its main features are its heavy, blunt attacks and its superior amount of regain. And I wanted to bring this up because this line seems designed to tell you two things about this particular weapon. First, it's letting you know that it does blunt damage. This is important to know if you really want to dig into Bloodborne's combat system. Blunt is a specialized type of physical damage as opposed to thrust damage. Now technically, not all of the Hunter Axe's moves do blunt damage, some just do straight physical damage. But still, this is an important line for helping you to understand how Bloodborne's combat system works, if that's the kind of thing you're interested in optimizing. And I feel like this is something that's communicated a little bit more clearly in the Japanese. And even if that doesn't necessarily come across in my translation of the more literal, its main features are its heavy blunt attacks, as opposed to the official, boasts a heavy blunt attack, the Japanese also visually signifies that the term blunt is important by surrounding it with what are essentially the equivalent of quotation marks. Now, the lack of a similar identifying feature in the English is probably the result of a larger stylistic decision. And that I think is understandable. Just imagine reading through the English and having the word blunt in quotation marks for some reason. There's a sense in which this comes down to a balance between understandability of gameplay mechanisms and acceptable style. And unsurprisingly, it's that same balancing act that comes into play with the other issue that I wanted to bring up in regards to this line, that of the rally system. We've talked about that system before. It's the one where you can regain some of the health that you've lost by attacking your enemies. And for context, remember that the official translation is boasts a heavy blunt attack leading to high rally potential, while a more literal translation is its main features are its heavy blunt attacks and its superior amount of regain. Also keep in mind that this is in the description for one of the very first items you're going to come across in the game. And I wanted to bring this up because it perfectly highlights my biggest issue with the term rally. Because as much as I love that term, and as appropriate as I think it is to the context of Bloodborne, when you're reading that item description for the very first time in the Hunter's Dream, I think it's much easier to understand the term regain than it is rally. Once again, this is a point where you have to weigh the value of gameplay information against the value of style. Finally, there was one more thing that I wanted to note about the rally system here. Note that the official translation is, boasts a heavy blunt attack, leading to high rally potential. This implies a connection between the heavy blunt attack and the amount of health you'll be able to regain with the rally system. Interestingly though, the Japanese doesn't make that same connection. It merely lists higher amounts of regain and heavy blunt attacks as two defining features of the Hunter Axe. But anyway, I realize I've spent a lot of time on the technical side of things here, but I wanted to dwell specifically on these issues because they come up a lot when you're translating a video game. But let's end on more of a lore-related note. Here's a comparison of a more literal versus the official translation of the last two lines of the Hunter Axe. Whatever their origins, beasts are no longer human, but a certain type of hunter gladly used this axe as if its meaning were for executions. So you can see there are some differences there, but I think these are both really good translations. While the official version of the first line does leave out the idea that beasts were once human, I feel like doing so in a way only emphasizes the point. Those who subscribe to this line of thinking simply think of beasts as beasts, no matter what their origins may have been. And though I do wish that in that last line the translators had been able to get across the idea that hunters play the part of executioners gladly, that phrase, play the part of executioners, sounds a lot better than gladly use this axe as if its meaning were for executions. And really, the phrase itself does kind of get across some idea of that attitude. And now that we've stumbled across this fellow, we're going to stop right here. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and that I'll see you again next time. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, please let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.